and welcome to the Quantum Bridge. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined for the first time by a new guest, Renee. So Gary has allowed me to do the intro piece this morning because he's not yet fully woken up. I'm not yet fully woken up, as you can tell.
The time difference,
yeah. but Renee will be, because there's a huge time difference between us. We're obviously based in the UK and Renee is over in Australia. So without further ado, Renee, good afternoon, good evening to you.
Yes, it is evening, and thank you very much. I've just had a very light dinner prior to this. So just to put your audience in the picture. But lovely to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me
to the show.
It's an absolute pleasure. And I haven't had breakfast, so I may have to mute myself occasionally as my stomach rumbles. And I think Gary was already complaining prior to recording about not having eaten. So from both of us, please don't tune in to our stomachs. Anyway, on that note, so Renee, people may or may not know Renee. Many will, in terms of her work as a journalist, and a lot of prolific work, various work over the years. But rather than me go on about any of that, and specifically because we're very much on this show about heart, about connection, and about people, Renee, I'd love to pass over to you for a moment, and maybe you can touch on sort of certain aspects about now, just for to frame things slightly. But actually, I'm very interested to go back to areas of your childhood and what you see as the sort of formative years and what created the Renee that we see before us now. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about yourself.
All right, I shall start from the most recent past. I released a film on the film festival circuit last year called Ticketyboo, and it's called A Secret in Plain Sight, and it's a documentary about Alzheimer's and my dad's art and how we maintain humour and stay connected to people we love as it feels like they're slipping away. And then because a lot of his artworks reveal things, I thought I really should do an ebook in support of this too, and also called Ticketyboo, so it makes it easy to find things. Just so if anyone was interested, they could look at his artworks and see the changes in his style, because that was, you know, one of the clues that I missed, because he went from being a very perfectionist realist with oil paints to very impressionist watercolours, and then to crayons, where it lost a lot of perspective, and he couldn't enjoy the new abstraction that Alzheimer's brought to his style. And I really loved it because I love abstract art, and so helping him see the beauty in the change was a difficult journey sometimes, but also a really rewarding one when I could manage to get through to him. So that's just what I did in the recent past. And I guess just to take you back to, I guess, my upbringing is, in a nutshell, I was a very rural girl. There was no pub or police station in the very small town that I lived in. And when I was 17 years old, my parents took me to Sydney to go to uni. I'd never seen a taxi before. I didn't know you could pay people money and they drove you around. That's how innocent I was. Yeah. And they dropped me off and went, here's some money, bye. And so started my adult life.
Right, okay. Let's go back even further beyond that, because what you've touched on about your father and what I've seen as well prior to inviting you to join us was very much about that. Well, I was very touched. It was very much on a heart level about that relationship that you had with your father. Now, I've got a great relationship with my daughters, which I'm very, very lucky to have. Did you have what you would consider a particularly strong, or maybe almost biased relationship towards your father? Or is that something that emerged? Take us back to maybe, I don't know, your earlier memories of your relationship with your father.
Well, having a very wicked, dark sense of humour with no sacred cows, no scared cows either if your spelling isn't great, My mum came from a family of 5 sisters and my dad came from a family of 5 brothers. So when I was born, mum wasn't that thrilled to have a daughter because she'd seen how her sisters treated each other. And she thought, you know what, I don't really like women. And then my dad had a similar experience with a stepfather and, you know, a difficult childhood. And so he was enamored with having a daughter and not all that fussed over having a son.
Yeah.
And so only 2 kids in the family meant that there wasn't as much sibling rivalry. It was like each of us had the parent that appeared to love us a little bit more than the other kid. Yeah. And we were quite good with it. It didn't damage the relationship I have with my brother. But Dad was, he had an amazing feminist streak in him because he taught me to write when I was 3 years old, just as I was walking. And so he would also play word games with me where he'd deliberately get them wrong so I could correct him, not the other way around. And I think it was very empowering, you know, as a little country girl, you know, still, you know, and growing up in a pretty sexist part of the world as well, to have that little bit of confidence as a kid. So I was very grateful for his gentleness there and his, I guess, he didn't need to be the boss of me. He wanted me to be the boss of me, which is, you know, as you just mentioned, you've got daughters, Casper, it's, women need that, you know.
Yeah. Oh, that's lovely. And was, just in terms of his work, was he actually making his money as an artist, or was he doing something else, as my father had to do, also an artist, to support him with a day job to allow him to indulge his creativity outside of that?
He was a self-taught artist because he grew up without any real mentoring or guidance into the art world. So he was very shy. He didn't want to exhibit his work. I think part of his Alzheimer's could be directly attributed to a lot of repressed memories that, you know, like when you get older, like the way I believe in ghosts is I think some of our long-term memories become much sharper than the short-term ones, and we become haunted a little bit by our past if there's some troubled times there. And so he did artistic work for money. Like he was, he did a lot of Federation restorations, you know, ornate ceilings, and did a lot of carving, and he built spec homes with another man, and they would sell them to make money, and he'd build them out of red cedar. And he couldn't bear to part with his paintings. He said that they were like his children, and to sell them would be akin to slavery, which I thought was just crackers. I thought it was just nuts. But he did this beautiful portrait of a Roman centurion, gave it away to someone who wanted it, and cried. Said, that's it, I'm never doing that again. So he had a very strange relationship to money. Well, he only ever carried $5 in his wallet. He just didn't have a strong relationship with it. But I think, you know, in truth, it's probably a lot more to do with confidence. He didn't want to have an exhibition and then find out that people would say, well, this is terrible. You know, you're not talented at all. So by keeping it all to himself, if there was a question mark about how talented he was, it was better to have the question than an answer that he feared.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. And in terms of your age around that sort of time, so when he gifted that painting, because obviously that had an effect on you. I'm not saying that was necessarily the most profound, and there's plenty of things I think that we're going to unearth here that are hugely profound. But what sort of age were you when does that memory come from?
That was when I was in high school, because I'd gone to a country boarding school for 4 years and then came home for what we call year 11 and 12. They'd be what do they call them in the UK? They're senior college years, aren't they?
Oh, I'm sort of lost now. Mine are luckily university and beyond, and I'm trying actually to forget.
I maybe should know because my wife is a teacher, but it's the little kids, the primary, so in between there somewhere. Yeah,
we're playing our get out of jail cards here.
Well, I was very, very excited that someone wanted it, and I was starting to be of an age where money meant something to me. It meant I could buy things, and so for him to not sell it and then complain about it, I remember being a bit annoyed and just saying, you know, you can sell a house, you can go and build a house out of red cedar, and I don't know, maybe I had some childish jealousy that the paintings meant more to him than maybe we did. But yeah, I think it was a little piece of his soul that came out of brushes and crayons and all of that went onto the canvas that he didn't know how to express in any other way, because his own dad had died when he was 6 years old.
Right.
He'd come back from World War II, and Dad was already the middle of 3 boys, the middle son. And he survived World War II and then was hit by a car and killed here in Sydney. And my nana, his mother, was a very beautiful woman, and she had a picture on the Milo tin, which is a very famous chocolate drink here in Australia that they give kids and big people. And she had 3 boys, so she married again very quickly and had 2 more boys with this other man who was quite brutal and had no time for Dad's sensitivity or his artistic temperament. And so I think that was very damaging, you know, to a little boy who was 6 years old who lost his own dad. Yeah,
and it does very much feel like a sign of the times, that type of empathy and that type of even social empathy. On that level, I don't think it really raised its head much, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think she did what she thought was best for everybody.
Yeah. Well, look, with that number of children and whatever, you've got to be pragmatic. And unfortunately, as you rightly say, for people that are sensitive, that's tough. I have to say on that thing about the paintings and the not wanting to sell them and the difficulty giving them away, actually, I've found with creative people, not least artists, that's not uncommon. In fact, I know some fantastic artists who are exactly like that. And I actually think there's something rather beautiful about that, because they know their worth, but at the same time, you're right, it doesn't allow them ever to put material out there and really get things moving commercially. Do you think that informed in any way we'll come on to obviously you becoming a journalist and so on, but in your later years, did that inform in any way the fact that you were more willing to package up parts of yourself and see them sold out there into the world? Do you think that there was any, that you sort of understood that you need to do that to move things forward?
I do, and I did. And one of the things that I have quipped in the past, which has shocked some people and amused others, was I've described a chunk of my journalist time, because I did some news, I did some criminal investigation, I did pirates in the Philippines, I was line producer on a doco there. And then I kind of got tired of lawyers ringing me up at 4 o'clock in the morning, or criminals and so on, lying lawyers and criminals. So I got sick of that. And so I went for the money. I went where it was relaxed. I moved more fully into film and doing interviews with people about film, but not gossip and so on. And so I described it as, it's a level of prostitution to which I have become accustomed. So I was able to package myself up and sell myself for about 10 years. And I really enjoyed it until one day I just didn't. And it became very meaningless and it became empty. And I knew that that sector of the media industry was done with me when I was asked if I would use the word film less, because it's a little posh, and use the word movie more.
Right.
And I knew that my time
to pull the trigger.
Correct.
I use that phrase advisedly, because the way I came across Renee, what a wonderful segue that was, was on your work with Chopper Read, and not least you facing down, albeit against your will and in the moment, a gun pointed at your head. Was that another pivotal moment in your life, by any chance, Renee?
Well, it was, and it became more pivotal when it exploded virally around the world in 2012. And that was because I remember my brother is an ex-cop, and in 1992, he gave me the first Chopper Read book that was written from letters that he'd sent along to a couple of Melbourne journalists. And my brother said, have a read of this, because if you read between the lines, he's telling some truths. There's a lot of lies there, but he's telling some truths about the relationship Australian criminals have with the cops, in that if you go and do this for us, we'll turn a blind eye to that. And so I thought, I'm going to go and interview this guy. And he'd never been on the telly before. And so he was wonderfully excited. So I packed up with a crew and went down to Tasmania, which is not just an island off Australia, it is a state and is part of Australia. Like, you know, you have the UK where you have all these different places that are all part. And I spent 3 days there with him, and I really wanted him to. Do you want me to tell you the story, or is this too long?
I'd love to hear.
Good. All right. And so I knew that I wanted him to play Russian roulette with himself, because, you know, he used to win all this money from the Chinese mafia. And that was one of my questions, is how did you win all this money from the Chinese mafia? And so something that I usually only reserve for private conversations, because just disclaimer, it was a very different time back then, and we did whatever we wanted to do to get a story. So I was very much in the school of not being the journalist in the ivory tower. It was, I'm going to be a real observational documentarian. I'll do what you do. What do you do at 10 o'clock in the morning, Chopper? And he said, I go to the Evandale pub and drink Dirty Fathers. So I said, that's what we're doing. And we were at the pub for 4 hours before we went out on this deserted road with guns and started shooting at things. So it was nutty by today's standards, but back then it was very exciting and a lot of fun. And so a Dirty Father, just in case anyone's wondering, I wasn't drinking that, I was drinking vodka. But a Dirty Father is 5 white spirits and milk in a 7-ounce glass. It is horrific.
It's like a White Russian and then some.
Yes, several White Russians crammed into a glass. And so we were suitably inebriated. And I remember when we'd gotten around to this part of the interview, and he's got this it's either a 44 Magnum or a 357. I've called it a 357.
It's big enough, Renee.
It's a big gun. It's the gun that the revolver that Dirty Harry used in some of his films with Clint Eastwood. Oh no, Clint Eastwood is Dirty Harry. And so he's got these 9mm bullets.
I think that was a 44 Magnum, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. Someone had corrected me in the past to that, so I will obviously stand corrected.
No, don't. Not by me. But anyway, sorry.
And so he's got, and like these 9mm hollow point bullets have got this lovely little silver top, but they make a hole about this size going in and about this size going out. And so he says, you've got to trust me, there's a slug in this gun. And I saw the bullet and I saw the gun, but I couldn't tell you if I physically saw him put it in there. And he is known to lie, but he's also known to do really crazy things too.
Yeah.
So he spun the barrel, pointed it at his own head, and it went click. And I was like, off camera, rubbing my hands together, thinking, this is such good television.
Yeah, that's
this is fantastic.
Come on.
And then he's a little over arm's length from me, and he says, now one slug for Renee. And I'm smiling because of the alcohol, and I certainly wasn't expecting what was going to happen next.
Yeah,
and he said, now one slug for Renee. And I'm going, I don't want to play. And he said, you don't want to play? Bad luck. boom, right in my face.
Now, what flashed through your mind at that moment, Renee? Anything at all?
It happened. I have delayed reactions to things. It happened a bit later, but the wonderful cameraman who'd been around the world in war zones, and I was like a cub reporter. This is one of my first stories.
Yeah.
He put the camera down and went, "All right, kids, that's enough. It's all got out of hand and we all need to calm down." And that's when Chopper said, "Now the camera's off, I'm going to tell you how I won all the money from the Chinese mafia," which was the original question.
Yeah.
And so he said, if you overly oil the barrel of a revolver and put a bullet in and then spin the barrel, the weight of the bullet will always take it to the third or fourth chamber. So the first 2 shots are clear. And he said, I'd have 2 shots at my own head. In theory.
Yeah, there's a lot of what ifs.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, just to say, one of the reasons, one of the first resonances for me with Renee, and many others have now come up since we've spoken off camera as well. But one of them was the way, now these days, who knows whether this is accurate, but you can tell me, Renee, perhaps, is I was reading some of the comments on that particular clip of that video you've just described. And a lot of people were talking about what they'd just seen very defensively on your behalf, which is lovely in itself. But it appeared that you had replied to a number of those, not least to one where you actually say words to the effect of, I actually like these sort of characters. I like people who are outside the norm and so on, right? Not saying necessarily you had a love for Chopper himself, but generally that there is something in you that resonates with those people who are living on the fringes. And of course, I thought, that's sort of like me. Whether it is or isn't, maybe it's how I'd like to think of myself. So I really enjoyed that. So firstly, were those sort of comments yours? And secondly, do they hark back to your earlier life, to your dad, to your formative years and other aspects? Or is that just Renee?
I think so, because it's kind of a big yes to a lot of the questions that you just asked. I stopped replying to the comments when a film student had posted the Chopper Read clip, or that first little story that I'd done. I did 3 of them in 2012 to Reddit. And then I woke up to thousands of messages thinking I'd been hacked or something like that. And then it became this thing where people would do like Gogglebox style videos of having the Chopper story on one side and then them slowing it down and explaining why this couldn't happen and this wasn't real and all of this sort of thing. And I think one of the funniest comments that I replied to, because it bugged me, was a guy claiming that it was all fake and that I was fake, and he was in Tanzania on the shoot. And that's when I thought, I need to correct this guy's geography. I can't let this one go. Because as we know, Tanzania is in a completely different continent.
Long way from Tasmania.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah. Some people have said to me, why don't you monetize it? Because it's had, quite a few views. But to be ethical, the only reason I put it up on YouTube was someone had put an old VHS copy up and was quite abusive of me. So I said, really, you've got 800,000 views out of this. I'm going to put up the really good quality television.
Yeah.
And I've got all this other material that if you hadn't have been such a horrible person, I would have shared with you because you had this great base to start with.
Yeah.
Now I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
And so
that'll teach you.
Yeah. And also too, ethically, I don't own the copyright.
Right.
So I didn't think it was fair to the person who owns the hard copyright that I monetize it.
Yeah. I suppose the big question that might be asked by the audience is, do you know or not whether there was a bullet in that gun?
He says there was, and he wrote in his second book, he devoted a whole chapter to me saying that I don't know how lucky I am to be alive, and that while it would have made great television if the gun had have gone off in my face, it wouldn't have been such a great career move for me.
I also know that there's a lot written about Chopper where it says things like, you know, he never wanted to let the truth get in the way of a good story. So
Yeah.
I suppose the beauty of a lot of those things is we might never know.
Yeah, and also too, like he was a very entertaining person, and he was a great interview subject, and he's very quotable because he's not very educated, but he has a lot of rat cunning.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, and he's clever and he's quick-witted, and all of those things create a certain amount of charm. But he also had this horrible switch, and as a woman, this used to really unnerve me, where he'd be all laughing and friendly one moment, and then he could look away at something and then turn back, and his whole face had changed and his eyes were different. And when I was trying to, I'd have phone calls with him, and we'd have the first phone call, which would all be great, hang up the phone, then it'd ring again, and there'd be this other person on the end threatening me, and, you know, and if you do this, Renee, and blah, 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 with this horrible growly voice. And so, and I would just be very transparent and honest, and I'd go, Chopper, I hate it when you do this. It really upsets me. You know, you can't switch personalities that quickly. And he goes, oh, I've got to do it, Renee. It's my shtick.
But do you think it was, or do you think that he was pretty much channeling a second entity there? Did it feel real to you, that switch?
I think he did it deliberately. I think it's a performance.
Right.
I don't think he had diminished mental capacity. I don't think he was losing his mind. I think it was performance. But
now, again, going back to your father, I don't want us to move too far away from that, but I think that those, one, because I imagine there's a great polarity there, but also because of the level of affection that you had for aspects, at least, of Chopper, was there anything, I suppose both of those guys, your father and Chopper, you know, again, there is a level of sort of the maverick spirit there, quite polar opposites. But was there something about your father that you liked or admired about the fact he was doing things that were very different? He was being inventive with his time and his creativity, and he actually was able, as you touched on, to compartmentalize and package parts of his creativity, whether that be to do with houses and so on, and actually put those out into the world without feeling that ownership. You know, did you see him as something of a maverick character, Renee?
Definitely, and a fringe dweller, and very much doing his own thing. Because I think when you're not encouraged, you're not part of the mainstream of a family, you can learn to love being a fringe dweller. And so I grew up, I didn't know that I'd grown up in the Addams family until I moved to Sydney and found out people weren't like us. And what I accepted as normal in our family was definitely not normal at all in others. And I got a little bit embarrassed in my late teens, and it took me a little while then to learn to embrace the upbringing that I had. It was, just to give you an example, like my parents were inseparable. Their love affair, I think, meant sometimes more than having kids, and they would build things together as well. And they built this little motel down the south coast. And the place was riddled with snakes and spiders, as Australia is. And so for show and tell, Dad hated killing things, but he also would do it occasionally. So he'd catch with his hands in just a jar funnel web spiders, which jump and are lethal within minutes. They're our most poisonous spider. And so they'd rear up and he'd say, come and have a look at this, kids, but stand back. And then he would put them, he'd stun the funnel web spider with a bit of Mortine or an insect spray, so it was groggy. And then he would get Mum's sewing kit, and he'd get some cotton wool and a pill bottle, and he would, before the spider died and all its legs crunched up, he would carefully sew the spider with the cotton wool, put it in the pill bottle, fill it full of metho, and then give it to me to take to school for show and tell. And we did this.
Now I can see why this affection and why I resonated with. Now I'm getting a whip. Now, Renee, I'd love to have you back on. I've noticed we've got a countdown on the screen. I've noticed that we're getting towards the end of this, and we've barely scratched the surface. I'd love you to consider coming back sometime, although there's never any pressure to do that. But I think that you've given some wonderful insights in such a short time into not just sort of your world, but your heart and many of those sort of deeper aspects of yourself, which I just want to say, I'm really happy and humbled that you've been willing to share those. So I want to say thank you for that, Renee. I would encourage you to come back sometime. But in the meantime, since that felt like a place that we could sort of stop and look at a next phase of this, is there anything further you'd like to say about Ticketyboo, either the book or the film? Please say something now about that.
Oh, I guess there's nothing extra. Like, I'm always keen for people to share their thoughts with how the book might help them. And also, too, I'd love to come back and, yes, who knows where this could go. So if you'd like to talk to me about some other things, I'm up for it, because I like you two guys, Gary and Caspar, and you're now my friends over in the UK. And there's plenty of other really interesting and heartfelt
stories. Well, we'd absolutely love to. Well, look, thank you very much indeed for joining us this time. Thank you again for your openness. We'll put the information on Renee's various different projects in our Show More section. But for now, from the Quantum Bridge, thank you very much indeed. Over and out. Thank you, Renee. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.